the royal guard who was assigned to protect a decision that was still being edited during enforcement. The orders arrived on a Tuesday, which was already suspicious. Nobody in Whitehall does anything decisive on a Tuesday. Mondays are for recovering from the weekend's emails. Wednesdays are for preparing for Thursday meetings. Thursdays are the meetings. Fridays are for writing summaries of what was decided in Thursday's meetings that will be quietly ignored by Monday. Tuesday is the day the building hums along on paperwork that nobody has technically authorized, but everybody pretends they have. So when Sergeant David Okafor received his assignment at 0743 on a Tuesday morning in the third week of February, the first thing he noticed was the date stamp. It read the 14th. Today was the 12th. He looked at it for a moment. He was standing in the briefing room on the ground floor of the old Admiralty building, holding a single sheet of paper in a manila envelope that had been handed to him by a corporal who had already left the room. The paper had 3 department seals on it. The Home Office seal was in the top left corner. The Cabinet Office seal was in the top right. A third seal, which Okafor did not immediately recognize, sat slightly off-center at the bottom of the page, as if it had been added after the fact by someone who was not entirely sure it belonged there. The orders themselves were 4 sentences long. Sergeant Okafor is assigned to security detail, Corridor 7, 2nd floor, Cabinet Wing, effective immediately. Access to Corridor 7 is restricted pending finalization of Policy Review CR 114. No personnel are to pass without authorization from the issuing office. Issuing office, see attached. There was no attachment. Okafor folded the paper once, put it back in the envelope, tucked the envelope under his arm and went to find Corridor 7. My name is Laura Reeves. In February of that year, I was 26 years old and 8 months into my first real job, which had the title Assistant Policy Coordinator and the practical function of carrying folders between people who did not want to talk to each other directly. I worked on the 3rd floor of the Cabinet Wing, which meant I walked past Corridor 7 every morning on my way to the lift. I want to be precise about what Corridor 7 was, because it matters. It was not an important corridor. It connected the main Cabinet Wing hallway to a small suite of secondary offices that had been used at various points in the last decade by a parliamentary working group on coastal erosion, a temporary task force reviewing hospital procurement standards, and, most recently, a 6-person team working on Policy Review CR 114, which concerned the reorganization of a specific set of interdepartmental communication protocols that I will not pretend to explain because I never fully understood them myself. The CR 114 team had vacated the offices 3 weeks earlier. The corridor had been empty since then. There was a fire exit at the far end, a water cooler that had been unplugged, and a framed photograph of the Thames at low tide that someone had hung slightly crooked and nobody had ever straightened. That was Corridor 7. When I arrived at work on the morning of the 12th, Sergeant David Okafor was standing at the entrance to it. I noticed him the way you notice something that has no business being where it is. Not because he was alarming. He was not alarming. He was standing in perfect parade rest, hands behind his back, eyes forward in the full dress uniform of the household division. Bearskin hat, scarlet tunic, the whole thing in the middle of a government office building, in front of a corridor that led to an unplugged water cooler and a crooked photograph of the Thames. I stopped walking. He did not look at me. I looked at him for a moment, then looked down the corridor behind him, then looked back at him. He continued to not look at me. I went upstairs and sat at my desk and sent a message to my colleague Priya, who had worked in the building for 4 years and knew things. The message said, "There is a household division guard standing in front of Corridor 7. Do you know why? Priya's response came back in 40 seconds. No idea. CR 114. I sent back. CR 114 was finished 3 weeks ago. She sent, was it though? I did not have an answer for that. The first official to challenge him arrived at 9:30. His name was Martin Fellows. He was a deputy director in the Cabinet Office. A tall man with the particular energy of someone who has spent 20 years being the second most important person in every room and has made peace with it. He carried a leather folder under one arm. He walked with the confident stride of a man who had never in his life been told he could not go somewhere. He was told he could not go somewhere. I need to access the CR 1114 suite, Fellows said. "I'm sorry, sir," Okafor said. "Corridor 7 is currently restricted." Fellows opened his leather folder. He produced a document. "I have authorization here from the Home Office. I'd need to verify that with the issuing office, sir. The issuing office is the Home Office." "Yes, sir. I'd need to verify with them directly." Fellows looked at the document. He looked at Okafor. He looked at the document again. The Home Office issued the document. "You're asking me to verify the document with the people who wrote the document?" "Yes, sir." There was a pause that lasted approximately 4 seconds, which is a very long time when a deputy director is involved. "Do you have a copy of your orders?" Fellows asked. Okafor produced the envelope. Fellows read the 4 sentences. He looked at the bottom of the page where the attachment was referenced. He turned the page over. He turned it back. "There's no attachment," he said. "No, sir. Your orders reference an attachment that doesn't exist." "Yes, sir. And you're still holding the post?" "Yes, sir." Fellows handed the paper back. He closed his leather folder. He looked at Okafor the way a man looks at a chess piece that has just made a move. He did not think was legal but cannot immediately find the rule to disprove. "I'll make some calls," he said, and walked away. I watched this from the far end of the hallway, pretending to read something on my phone. The second official arrived at 10:15. Her name was Sandra Obi, and she was from the Home Office itself, which should have resolved things immediately. She was carrying a different document. It had a different seal. It said, in language that was clearer than Okafor's original orders, that Corridor 7 was restricted to all non-essential staff pending finalization of CR 11-4, but that essential staff with appropriate Home Office clearance were to be permitted access during the review period. Okafor read it carefully. "Could you define essential staff, ma'am?" Sandra Obi looked at the document. "It says appropriate Home Office clearance." "Yes, ma'am. And the issuing office for clearance verification?" She checked. It says, "See attached schedule." There was no attached schedule. By 10:45, Martin Fellows had returned with a third document. This one from the Cabinet Office, which contradicted the Home Office document on the question of whether the restriction applied to permanent staff or all staff, and which defined the review period as either ending on the 14th or beginning on the 14th, depending on which paragraph you read and whether you interpreted the word commencing as referring to the restriction or the review. I had given up pretending to do anything else. I was sitting on a bench in the hallway with my folder on my lap, watching. Okafor read each document as it was presented to him. He was not rude. He was not dismissive. He asked precise, specific questions about jurisdiction, verification procedures, and the definition of terms. Every question was reasonable. Every question exposed a gap in the paperwork that the person presenting it had not previously noticed. By 11 o'clock, there were 5 people standing in the hallway outside Corridor 7, each holding a different document, engaged in a conversation that had stopped being about Okafor entirely and become about the documents themselves. Okafor stood at parade rest and waited. At some point, Priya appeared beside me on the bench. I don't know when she arrived. She had a cup of tea. "Has he moved?" she whispered. "Not once," I said. She offered me a sip. I took it. "What's actually in the corridor?" she asked. "An unplugged water cooler," I said, "and a slightly crooked photograph of the Thames." She thought about this. "Worth protecting," she said. The lawyer arrived at 12:30. His name was Christopher Unwachukwu, and he was from the government's legal advisory team, and he arrived with the particular calm of a man who has been called in to fix something and has already, on the walk over, identified exactly how bad it is. He did not attempt to enter the corridor. He stood a few feet away from Okafor, read through all 5 documents that had accumulated over the course of the morning, and then asked to see Okafor's original orders again. He read them twice. Then he looked up. "Sergeant," he said, "I need to tell you something, and I want to be straightforward about it." "Go ahead, sir." "The original order you were given, the one that assigned you to this post, was not a finalized document. It was a draft. It was generated by the CR 114 working group as part of their planning process, and it was stamped and distributed by administrative error 3 days before the policy it relates to was scheduled to be approved." He paused. "The policy has not been approved. It is currently in the third of what was supposed to be 4 review stages. Nobody has signed it. Legally speaking, the order you are holding does not have authoritative standing. The hallway was quiet. Okafor looked at the document in his hand. He looked at Nwachukwu. "I understand, sir," he said. "You understand that the order is not legally binding." "Yes, sir." Nwachukwu waited. Okafor did not move. "Sergeant, the order is not valid. I've been assigned to this post, sir. Until I receive new orders from a verified commanding officer, I'll hold it." Nwachukwu looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the 5 officials behind him, each holding their contradictory documents. Then he looked back at Okafor. "Who issued your assignment this morning?" he asked. "A corporal, sir. He'd already left when I read the orders." "And you can't reach him?" "No, sir." "And there's no attachment?" "No, sir." Nwachukwu closed his folder. He turned to face the group of officials. "Right," he said in the tone of a man who has done the calculation and found it does not balance. "Someone get me a conference room. I want to tell you what the next 40 minutes looked like from the hallway, because I stayed. I should not have stayed. I had 3 tasks due by end of day and a meeting at 2 o'clock that I had not prepared for. I stayed anyway, sitting on my bench, watching the most formally dressed man in the building stand completely still while the building moved around him. Officials came and went. Phones were used. At one point, a woman I didn't recognize arrived with a printed email chain that was 14 pages long and tried to summarize it for Okafor, who listened politely and then asked which signatory had departmental authority for Corridor 7 specifically. At which point the woman with the email chain went quiet for a long moment and then said she would find out. She did not come back. A man from security arrived and asked Okafor to confirm his assignment on the internal system. Okafor said he was happy to, but that his orders did not include a case reference number for the system and asked which office could provide one. The man from security made 3 calls, got 3 different answers and left. At one point there was a disagreement at moderate volume between Martin Fellows and Sandra Obi about whether the Home Office or the Cabinet Office had primary jurisdiction over Corridor 7, a question that apparently had not been asked before because nobody had previously needed to answer it. Okafor stood in parade rest throughout all of it, perfectly still, perfectly polite. A fixed point in a building that was becoming less fixed by the minute. I thought about something my father used to say when I was a child, when I would ask him why he bothered to keep promises even when the other person had forgotten making them. He would say that a promise is not really for the other person, it's for the version of you that has to live with what you did. I don't know why I thought of that. I wrote it down in the margin of the folder on my lap and drew a small box around it. The emergency meeting happened in conference room 4B, which was around the corner and down 1 flight of stairs. I know this because Priya was sent to take notes, and she told me about it afterward in exhaustive detail. Partly because she is thorough, and partly because she needed to tell someone, and I was available. The meeting lasted 38 minutes. Present were Christopher N. Nwachukwu, Martin Fellows, Sandra Obi, 2 other officials whose names Priya wrote down and I have since forgotten, and a senior civil servant named Diane Hartley, who had been pulled out of a separate meeting and arrived looking the way people look when they've been pulled out of a meeting and not yet told why. The first 10 minutes were spent establishing what had happened. The next 10 were spent establishing whose fault it was, which was not resolved. The final 18 were spent doing what 3 weeks of review stages and interdepartmental consultation had failed to do. They finalized CR 1104 not because they were ready, not because every outstanding question had been answered, because they were standing in a building where a royal guard was holding an unauthorized post in front of a corridor containing an unplugged water cooler, and the only way to make him stand down was to give him valid orders, and the only way to give him valid orders was to sign the policy those orders were supposed to come from. Diane Hartley signed it at 1347. She asked, before she signed, why it hadn't been done 3 weeks ago when the working group submitted it. There was a silence. Someone said there had been concerns about the wording of paragraph 7. Someone else said the concerns had been addressed in the second revision. Someone said they hadn't seen the second revision. Hartley signed it. Priya texted me from inside the room, "It's done." I went downstairs. Okafor was still at his post when Nwachukwu came back with the signed policy and a new set of orders. These ones dated correctly with an attachment. Nwachukwu handed them over. Okafor read them. He looked at the attachment. He looked at the signature. He stepped aside. "Thank you, sir," he said. Nwachukwu looked at him for a moment. "You knew," he said. It wasn't quite a question. Okafor didn't answer immediately. He folded the new orders and placed them in his breast pocket. "You knew this morning that the original order wasn't valid," and Nwachukwu said, "I could see it when I told you." "You already knew." "I had questions about the paperwork, sir, yes, and you held the post anyway. I was assigned to the post, sir." Nwachukwu looked at him for another moment. Then he looked down the corridor at the unplugged water cooler and the crooked photograph of the Thames. He looked like a man trying to find the right word for something and finding that the available words are all slightly the wrong size. He nodded once and walked away. I watched Okafor straighten his tunic. He glanced down the corridor once the way a person glances at a finished task. Then he turned and walked in the direction of the main stairwell back straight, step even, already somewhere else entirely in his mind. I followed him, at a distance without quite deciding to. I did not speak to him that day. I wasn't sure what I would say, and I have learned, slowly, that the impulse to say something is not always a good enough reason to say it. I thought about it for the next 3 months. I thought about it while I processed the amended CR 114 documentation, which crossed my desk in its finalized form 2 weeks after the incident and contained, in its preamble, no reference whatsoever to the circumstances of its finalization. I thought about it when I walked past Corridor 7, which became a normal corridor again, people moving through it freely, the water cooler plugged back in. The photograph of the Thames still slightly crooked because nobody had straightened it and nobody was going to. I thought about what it meant to hold a post that you know is built on paperwork that doesn't exist yet. I found him in May, on a grey Wednesday morning, standing outside the entrance to a different building on the far side of Whitehall. Different post, same stillness. He was watching something across the street with the kind of alert absence that very good guards have, present and not present at the same time. I stopped in front of him. "Sergeant Okafor," I said. He looked at me. There was a brief moment of orientation, the way people look when they are placing a face from a different context. Then he nodded slightly. "The bench," he said. "Yes, I was on the bench. I remember. I had thought about how to ask this for 3 months. I had written several versions. They all felt like the wrong size. In the end, I just said it plainly. Did you know that morning? That the orders weren't valid." He looked at me for a moment, not deciding whether to answer, I thought. Deciding how? The date was wrong, he said. The attachment was missing. 3 department seals on a 4-sentence document is 2 seals too many. Someone was covering something. He paused. "Yes, I knew. Why did you hold it?" He was quiet for a moment, not a long moment. The kind that means the answer exists and is being selected carefully. "Because someone had to," he said. "The decision was real. The people who needed it were real. The fact that the paperwork had got ahead of itself didn't make the decision less real. It just meant it hadn't caught up yet." Another pause, shorter. "Someone had to stand there until it did. I thought about my father. About promises and the versions of ourselves that live with what we do. Nobody's going to write that down." I said, "What you did, it's not in any report." "No," he said. "Doesn't that bother you?" He looked back across the street. Something in his posture suggested the question was being considered seriously. "Not dismissed. The corridor's open," he said. "The policy's signed." "The work happened." He glanced at me briefly. "That's what gets written down. The work." I stood there for a moment longer. I wasn't sure what I had expected him to say. Something more maybe, something that explained the architecture of it more fully, but I have thought about those words. The work happened many times since, and I think they might be complete. I think they might be exactly the right size. I thanked him, he nodded. I walked away. I want to tell you what I think this story is about, because I have been carrying it around long enough that I have formed a view. It is not about bureaucracy, though bureaucracy is all over it. It is not about the absurdity of government, though that is in there too. It is not even really about Sergeant David Okafor, though he is the fixed point around which everything else moves. It is about what happens when someone decides to act as if a thing is true before it has been made officially true. The decision that CR14 represented was not wrong, it was not fraudulent, it was not a mistake. It was real work done by real people trying to solve a real problem. It had been real for weeks. What it lacked was the final act of institutional commitment, the signature, the stamp, the moment when the system says, yes, this is what we are doing, this counts. Institutions are extraordinarily good at deferring that moment. There are always more review stages. There are always concerns about paragraph 7. There are always 2 more people who need to be consulted, 2 more seals that need to be added, 2 more questions that need to be answered before the thing can be made real. What Okafor did was refuse to participate in the deferral. He received orders that were premature, incomplete, and technically unauthorized. He held them. He held them not because he didn't know they were flawed, he knew, but because behind the flawed paperwork was something real that needed holding until the institution found the will to hold it itself, and because he held it, the institution was forced to catch up. I have thought about what the alternative looked like. Okafor reads the orders on Tuesday morning, notes the date stamp, notes the missing attachment, notes the 3 seals, flags it as irregular, returns to base, waits for clarification. Entirely reasonable, entirely correct procedure. CR 114 goes back into the review process. Another 2 weeks pass, another round of consultations. Paragraph 7 continues to be a concern. The corridor sits empty, the decision remains unmade. Nobody gets in trouble. Everything proceeds correctly. The work does not happen. There is a word I keep reaching for, and cannot quite find in English for what Okafor did. Something between holding a line and holding a space. Standing in for an act of institutional will that the institution had not yet performed but would perform, if pressed, if made necessary, if someone refused to pretend that the absence of a signature meant the absence of a thing worth protecting. I don't know the word. I have looked. I'm not sure the word exists in English for what it means to guard a decision that is still becoming real. I think David Okafor knew the word, though. I think he knew it the way people know things they have never had to explain, not from being taught it, but from being the kind of person for whom it has always been true. He stood in front of Corridor 7 on a Tuesday morning in February, in full dress uniform, bearskin and scarlet and all, in front of an unplugged water cooler and a slightly crooked photograph of the Thames, holding 4 sentences and a missing attachment. He held it until it became something worth holding. That is what gets written down. The work happened.